And I will close with this. This is a bit of my own response to the massacre of the Jesuits. As I said, I went from Nicaragua to El Salvador for the funeral. Several of us Jesuits went from Nicaragua up to the funeral, and it was just an overwhelming experience, as you might imagine, to see first the 8 coffins lined up in the chapel of the university, and then the next day the family of Elba and Selena decided to bury them in their own hometown. So then there were 6 coffins of the Jesuit priests lined up in the chapel and for the funeral mass, and they were buried in crypts in the wall of the chapel of the university, and they're still there. Sometimes when I go there, I find students and others kind of sitting there, looking at the crypts, looking at the contemplating the lives of these Jesuits who were buried there, and the students, probably reflecting on what this means to them. This is the way they lived their lives. They gave their life for Christ. They gave their life in the struggle for justice for their people. What am I doing with the education that I'm receiving at this same university? This is what the students would be meditating on. So after the funeral, I decided to go to the US. I felt that as a gringo, as a North American citizen, that I needed to go to Washington to raise a ruckus about this, just to try to organize some people. There was already, organizing was beginning. How to respond to this, what to do in relation to this horrible martyrdom and massacre that we had seen. Because an important aspect of this is the involvement of the US government, our government. And I, as an American citizen living in Latin America, I'm always aware of the role that my government has played in the history of Latin America. And it's not a very favorable one. It's not a very good one, generally. We have done some good things, but we've also done some very unjust and violent kinds of things. For instance, the army of El Salvador that carried out this brutal attack on the Jesuits was financed and trained by the US. This is something that we commemorate every year down at the School of the Americas in Georgia. At the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, that is where thousands of soldiers over many years of Latin America and officers have been trained by the US Army. And so in many ways, the training that they receive in counterinsurgency, crowd control, that kind of thing, general military science, is put to use by them against their own people, generally. In putting down strikes, student demonstrations can get fired upon, or people can get arrested, or in suppressing revolutions throughout Latin America. Dr. King, Martin Luther King, said that our country has generally been on the wrong side of the revolutions in the world. That we have played a role of supporting the oligarchy, supporting the upper class, supporting the 5% at the top, the 14 families of El Salvador, against their own people when those people rise up to try to change things. Unfortunately, our government has generally played a very, we would say, a conservative role, that is, to conserve, to preserve the status quo. That's unfortunately the role that our government has played as I see it. El Salvador, it was training of the troops. 19 of the 26 special forces Salvadoran soldiers who killed the Jesuits had been trained at the School of the Americas by the US Army at Fort Benning. And the whole squadron of 26 had been trained by our special forces in El Salvador in a kind of mobile training program. They were supplied, the Salvadoran army was supplied by the US, supported financially and with military equipment by the US government. So here I am, an American citizen, and I've been living in Nicaragua. The US was also playing a very, I feel, negative and destructive role in Nicaragua, but here I am at the funeral of my 6 brothers, Jesuits, who had just been killed by their army, and yet my government is the main support of that army and the trainer of those troops. Archbishop Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was killed by an assassin in 1980, at the beginning of that decade, he had written a letter to Jimmy Carter, asking Carter to stop sending military aid to my government. He said, President Carter, please do not send any more military aid to my government, the troops of my government, because it's only helping them to kill more and more of my people, the poor, the peasants, the workers, students, so forth. Carter did not heed the call. He did not respond at all to that request by the Archbishop, and within a few weeks the Archbishop was killed by an assassin, a Salvadoran assassin. So anyway, I'm thinking of all that here at the funeral, and I'm saying, wow, I have to do something as an American citizen. You know, it doesn't, this is sort of part of my responsibility. I mean, I feel very proud of our government when it does good things in the world. But when it does negative things, things that are counter to the people, against the spirit of justice and so forth, I feel that it is acting in my name. It's doing that in my name. And I have to say, no, you're not doing that. You're not sending military aid. You're not training Salvadoran officers to torture and kill their own people in my name. So I came to Washington, and I started talking with some friends in the peace movement, the Catholic worker movement, and we put together a little action of civil disobedience, a very minor thing in comparison with what had just happened in El Salvador, but we poured some blood on the front gateposts of the White House, out by the sidewalk. If you've been to the White House, you see that there's a big gate along the sidewalk, and the sort of thick gateposts out there. And but we wanted to do a symbolic act, so we poured blood on the gateposts of the White House. Just a way of saying that the blood of the martyrs, you know, in part is here, partially is here at the White House, because of U.S. policy of paying for the guns, sending the bullets, training the troops, and politically supporting a very repressive government of El Salvador.